The 6 elements I like to include in my scientific abstracts are the background of my research, the question, the hypothesis, the results, and the conclusion. The approach is probably the most accepted, and let's see why it's so widely used. The 6 elements that I mentioned are, at the end of the day, the 6 steps of the scientific method. So before we start, let's refresh our understanding of the scientific method itself. A visit to Wikipedia can provide a comprehensive overview, but the scheme on the right may summarize it well. Actually, the narrative of the scientific method can be applied to any story of transformation. So let's see how the narrative of the scientific method maps to a story of transformation, just to help fix ideas and help you remember how the method works. First, we have the introduction. It is essentially what you are going to study. In our imaginary story, let's think about someone working hard and doing some experiments in the lab. Second, we have the hypothesis. Based on previous knowledge, how do you predict your experimental system will behave in a novel situation? For our researcher, we can predict that after so much work and finally getting some results, writing about the findings would be the easy part. After all, she did all the experiment to generate that data. Third comes the experiment. Here you describe, of course, the experiments that you did to test your hypothesis. This is the climax where your character faces the novel situation. In the case of our researcher, this is when she actually needs to sit down and write the abstract for her experiment. Then you have the results. Here you objectively describe what happened with your experiment. In our story, it usually happens. Writing always turn out to be more complicated than anticipated. After that, you have the discussion. Here we discuss the implications of the results in relation to your new understanding of your experimental system. In our researcher story, we can conclude that even when you do the experiments for a study, writing about the results is not always that easy. Finally, you are left with questions. For our researcher, it could be why writing about something one did could still be so challenging, and what can be done to make the process easier in the future. Although ending with a question is a common practice in a novel or a Netflix series, it's unusual in scientific abstract. People want the answers to the questions and not be left with open. So if we can finish with the question, we will ask the question from the beginning, but we will bring it after the background and not before to provide some minimal context. In this case, the background is like the summary of what happened in the previous episode of a Netflix series before arriving to the cliffhanger or the question. Let's examine a paper recently published in PLOS Genetics by a colleague to see how they wrote their abstract. First, they start with a couple of sentences for the background saying PIWI proteins and their associated piRNA act to silence transposon and promote gametogenesis, and so on and so forth. Then they implicitly introduce the question, writing the in vivo regulatory roles of these RG motifs in directing PIWI in piRNA biogenesis and spermatogenesis remain elusive. The implied question here is, are these RG motifs functionally relevant or not? Following this, they present the hypothesis. Also implicitly, they write to investigate the functional significance of RG motifs in mammalian PIWI proteins in vivo. Here, the hypothesis could be stated: we hypothesize that the RG motifs are functionally significant. It is common to see the questions and hypotheses being quite similar, so a common practice is to skip the hypothesis altogether to maintain a fast pace and keep the abstract short as well. Then the authors of the study delved into the method, stating, we genetically engineer an arginine to lysine RK point mutation of a conserved N-terminal RG motif in MIWI in mice. It is not necessary to delve deeply into the details here. It is enough to let the reader know the approach taken to answer the question. Some people also skip this section altogether, but I'm not sure this is the best practice, as I always want to have at least a rough idea of the approach the people are using to test their hypothesis. After the methods, the authors go through the results. While for the previous sections you should use 1 or 2 sentences max, the results can extend to 3 or 4 or even more if you need. In the manuscript, the authors write, We show that this tiny MeWe-RG motif is indispensable for pire-enabled genesis and male fertility, and so on and so on. They conclude with the following sentence. These findings reveal a crucial function of the RG motif in directing PWE proteins to engage efficient pire-RNA production. Notice that no further questions are asked. Hey, if you find this guide useful, check out my other videos on writing a research manuscript. You can access them by clicking the link above. Okay, I will leave you with a little short exercise to pick ideas. Let's write now a scientific abstract for the story of our scientist. This is how I wrote it. I'm just kidding, check the video description for my version, and it would be great if you can share yours down in the comments.